Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into an opinion piece about New York City's housing laws. It argues the whole system is broken, but maybe not in the way you'd expect.
Right off the bat, the source article throws this idea out there. It's a pretty provocative statement, and it really frames the entire debate around the struggles it says property owners are facing in one of the toughest real estate markets in the world.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the main claim. That being a landlord in New York is a losing game. Then we'll get into the politics, try to navigate the wild rent and eviction process, tally up the costs of all this control, and finally see what the author thinks the solution is.
So first up, let's really unpack this core idea that the article puts forward. This notion that if you own rental property in New York, you're pretty much set up to fail.
The main point here is that the legal scales aren't just tipped, they're completely broken. From this author's perspective, the whole system is so lopsided that just doing the basic job of being a landlord is almost impossible.
Now, what's so interesting here is how the source uses this quote. It's not presented as a good thing like, hooray for renters' rights. Instead, it's used as Exhibit A for what the author sees as an extreme legal environment, one that puts New York in a category all by itself.
So you might be asking, where did all these policies come from? Well, the article argues it's no accident. It points a finger directly at the city's political leaders.
The article really hones in on the city's leadership, suggesting their actions show a clear anti-landlord agenda. It talks about things like the mayor's rental ripoff tours and then looks at his appointment of Care Weaver to head the office to protect tenants. The source then digs up past statements it attributes to Weaver, using them to suggest an ideology that's deeply skeptical of private property rights in the first place.
Okay, so how does all this political talk actually play out in the real world? Well, the source starts with one of the most basic parts of the landlord-tenant relationship. What happens when you need to evict someone? According to the source, trying to evict a tenant who isn't paying rent is just this long, winding, and frustrating road. You've got guaranteed city-funded lawyers for tenants, court cases that can stretch out for over a year, and, get this, even if the landlord wins in court, it's still not over.
And this right here really drives the point home. Think about this. Even after a judge finally orders an eviction, a tenant can ask the court for a delay, and that delay can be for up to another full year, just by claiming they can't find a similar apartment in the area.
The article also shines a light on a city program it calls one-shot deals. Basically, this is when the city steps in and just pays off a tenant's back rent. This stops the eviction dead in its tracks, and the tenant gets to stay put.
Now here's the article's big critique of that program. It claims this just creates a kind of rinse and repeat cycle. The argument is that a tenant can get bailed out by the city, then stop paying rent all over again, and eventually just move on, leaving the next landlord to deal with the exact same problem.
So it's not just about evictions. The source also argues that the city's rent regulations put landlords in a serious, and maybe even unsustainable, financial bind.
Just look at this number for a second. 960,000. That's how many rent-stabilized apartments there are in New York City. We're talking about units where the law puts a cap on how much the rent can go up. And according to the source, it's this massive scale that gives these regulations such a huge financial punch.
The article says this whole situation creates a major financial squeeze. You can kind of see it here. On one hand, you have a board appointed by politicians that can clamp down on rent increases, sometimes even freezing them at 0%. But on the other hand, you have the landlord's actual costs, property taxes, heat, repairs, and those are all going up and up.
And apparently a 2019 law made this even trickier. The source says that if a landlord has to spend, say, $20,000 on a brand new heating system, they're only allowed to raise the rent by 2% to cover that massive cost. The author literally calls it a tourniquet on income.
So what happens when you have all this financial pressure? Well, the alleged result is disinvestment. The article claims that landlords are just leaving at least 26,000 rent-stabilized apartments totally empty because they figure it's better to make no money on them than to actually lose money by renting them out.
Now, here's a point the author really hammers home. These tenant protections aren't just for people with low incomes. It points out, for example, that the state's good cause eviction law can cover two-bedroom apartments that are renting for more than $6,800 a month.
And to really drive this home, the source brings up a pretty high-profile example. It focuses on Zohran Mamdani, a politician who was a big champion of these laws. This number you see here, that was his base salary when he was in the state assembly.
And here's the kicker, according to the article. It puts that six-figure salary right next to the fact that he himself was living in a rent-stabilized apartment. The author uses this to argue that the system isn't just helping the needy, but also high earners who could easily afford to pay market rate rent.
So where does all of this lead? Let's check out the article's conclusion and see how it pulls all these threads together for its final argument.
So the article's entire argument really boils down to this. The legal balance has swung so far that tenants in these rent-stabilized units actually have more power than the people who own the buildings. The source mentions how tenants can pass their apartments down to family members, almost like it's inherited property. And the big conclusion is that this wearing away of property rights isn't just a headache for landlords. It's the real reason the city has a housing shortage.
And that's the author's final prescription. The piece argues that the only way to fix New York's housing market isn't to add more rules and protections, but to go back to basics and restore the rights and the decision-making power of property owners.
And all of this leaves us with the huge central question that this whole debate really hinges on. This source lays out a clear argument that when you prioritize tenant protections this heavily, you directly cause a housing shortage. It's a really critical idea to chew on as you think more about this incredibly complex issue.